There's a particular kind of invisibility that has nothing to do with being small. Eleanor Marsh understood this better than most, because she was not small in any dimension that could be measured, and yet she had spent the better part of 7 years becoming the most thoroughly unnoticed essential person in the entire city of Callaway Bay. She was the woman people looked past when they were looking for someone else, the woman whose name came up only in the same breath as a problem that had already been solved, the woman who could walk into a room full of dangerous men and leave it with all of her secrets intact, simply because not one of those dangerous men had thought to study her face long enough to remember it. She had cultivated that invisibility the way a gardener cultivates a hedge, steadily, patiently, with the understanding that the hedge was also a wall and the wall was also a defense, and that one day the defense would matter more than the dignity she had traded for it. That day arrived on a Tuesday in October, and it arrived in the form of a dog. His name was Cosimo, and he weighed 11 pounds, and he was a Maltese of such spectacular whiteness and such imperious temperament that he had once caused a meeting between 3 rival lieutenants to collapse entirely because he had decided to sit in the center of the conference table and would not be moved. He belonged to Dorian Voss, which meant that in practical terms he was the most protected animal within a 200-mile radius, because Dorian Voss was the kind of man around whom protection organized itself automatically, the way iron filings organize themselves around a magnet, not because they are commanded to, but because the field simply demands it. Dorian ran the eastern seaboard operation of an organization so thoroughly embedded in the legitimate economy of Callaway Bay that the city's 3 largest charitable foundations all bore the fingerprints of his accountants, and the mayor attended his Christmas party with the particular eagerness of a man who understood that certain invitations were not optional. He was 41 years old, 6'2", and possessed of the kind of controlled, unhurried authority that made other powerful men speak more carefully in his presence. He wore his suits in the way other men wore armor. He had gray eyes that recorded everything and granted nothing, and a voice so measured and low that people often leaned forward instinctively to catch his words, which gave him, Eleanor had observed, an effortless structural advantage in every conversation he had ever conducted. Eleanor was 34. She had been his veterinarian for those 7 years, the one who managed Cosimo's quarterly wellness checks, his dental cleanings, his occasional bouts of digestive drama that arrived with the reliable unpredictability of small dogs convinced the world owed them rich food. She ran a practice 11 blocks from the Voss organization's primary legitimate front, a property management company whose glass facade threw light across the street in the early mornings like a mirror angled at the sun. Her clinic was called Marsh Animal Care, which was not a glamorous name, and she had not intended it to be. Her 3 examination rooms were immaculate and smelled of antiseptic and faintly of the lavender diffuser she kept near reception because one of her technicians had once read that it calmed anxious animals, and Eleanor had found no evidence to contradict it, so the diffuser stayed. She was 5'5", and broad-shouldered and soft in the way that the women in the magazines in her waiting room were not, and she had made a separate peace with her body, the way one makes peace with a faithful, complicated companion, acknowledging its demands and its gifts without drama, because there was enough drama in the world already without adding to it unnecessarily. She was good at her job with the particular deep-grained competence that comes not from talent alone, but from talent refined by years of showing up when showing up was hard. She had put herself through veterinary school after her mother's first cardiac event and through the licensing process after her mother's second. And she had opened the clinic in a neighborhood that other practitioners had deemed not quite profitable enough, because it was the neighborhood where she had grown up and where she knew the people and where the animals deserved exactly as much care as the animals in richer zip codes, and possibly more, because their owners had fewer alternatives when something went wrong. She had built her practice on competence and discretion and a certain quality of stillness that animals responded to the way plants respond to water, with immediate and uncomplicated trust. The same quality, it turned out, made her very good at not being remembered by men who preferred to underestimate everything that did not threaten them directly. Dorian Voss had never once looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered to him. She had understood this within the first 3 visits, when it became clear that he brought Cosimo himself rather than sending the dog with an assistant, not because he valued the relationship with the vet, but because he valued the ritual of control, the confirmation that the one small creature he permitted himself to love unconditionally was in a room he had personally approved. He would stand in her examination room with his arms folded and his gray eyes tracking the movements of her hands on the dog with the focused attention of a man assessing a professional service, which was precisely what she was providing him. And she would conduct the examination with steady, unhurried competence, and he would ask precise questions, and she would give precise answers, and then he would leave. And she would not cross his mind again until the next appointment appeared in her schedule like a stone dropped into still water, brief and complete and gone. She had stopped minding. That was the truth of it, and it was a truth she held without particular bitterness, the way one holds any fact that is simply accurate and unchangeable. She had Cosimo's records going back to puppyhood. She knew every vaccination, every parasite panel, every molar extraction, the hairline fracture in the third toe of the left rear paw that had healed cleanly because she had caught it early. She knew the dog better than anyone in the world except possibly the dog himself, and she knew in the unsentimental clinical way that a good veterinarian knows things that Cosimo preferred her examination table to any other surface because he had learned that the surface was always warm and that the hands that moved across his body were always looking for something specific and never hurting him carelessly. Animals remember competence. Animals, in their uncomplicated way, return to it. This is why, on the Tuesday in October, when Cosimo disappeared from the Voss compound during a security rotation that lasted exactly 47 minutes, he traveled 11 blocks in the particular direction of warmth and familiarity, and let himself in through the propped open side door of Marsh Animal Care the way small dogs with excellent memories and no comprehension of the chaos they are causing will sometimes do. The clinic had been closed for 20 minutes. Eleanor was alone in the building, finishing the last of her patient notes at the front desk because she worked at the front desk after hours when no one needed the examination rooms, and she had looked up at the small sound of nails on linoleum to find 11 pounds of immaculate white dog walking toward her with the serene entitlement of a creature who has never once considered that any door is truly closed to him. She had said, softly, in the particular tone she used for animals in unfamiliar situations, which was lower than her speaking voice and absolutely steady. "Hello, Cosimo." And he had looked at her with his dark, liquid eyes, sneezed once with tremendous dignity, and climbed into her lap. She had let him. She had set down her pen and let him arrange himself across her thighs with his small nose tucked against her elbow, and within 4 minutes he was asleep with the totality of commitment that small dogs bring to sleep, limbs loose, breathing slowed, completely and devastatingly unconscious in the middle of what she was already beginning to understand was about to become someone's emergency. She reached carefully across the desk, not disturbing him, and called the number she had in her records listed under Voss emergency contact, which went to a man named Reed who managed the day-to-day logistics of Dorian's personal arrangements and who answered on the first ring with the controlled urgency of a man who was already aware that something had gone wrong. She told Reed where Cosimo was. She told him the dog appeared healthy, was sleeping, and that she would keep him comfortable until someone could collect him. Reed said, in a voice that was attempting calm and mostly achieving it, that someone would be there directly. She heard 3 other voices in the background before the call ended, and she recognized the particular acoustic quality of a room full of people all talking at once in the controlled register of men trained not to raise their voices and failing, briefly, to maintain that training. She made a pot of the tea she kept for late evenings and arranged a thin fleece blanket from the supply cabinet over her lap without waking Cosimo, and continued her patient notes left-handed, because his head was against her right elbow and she had no intention of disturbing him. She had nearly finished when the door of the clinic opened without a knock, which she had expected, and Dorian Voss walked in, which she had not. She had expected Reed. She had expected one of the interchangeable, capable men who moved through Dorian's world at the edges of her awareness, present, but not primary, the way furniture is present. She had not expected Dorian himself in a charcoal suit that had not been designed for 11-block walks conducted at speed, his gray eyes arriving at her face with an expression she had no existing category for, because in 7 years she had never seen him unguarded, and he was, in this moment, minutely and unmistakably unguarded. There was something in the set of his jaw that was not fear, but was adjacent to it, in the way that intense relief is adjacent to the fear it is replacing, and he had stopped 3 feet inside the door and was looking at her, at Cosimo asleep across her lap, at the blanket and the tea and the patient notes open beside her on the desk with an expression that moved through 3 distinct phases in the space of a single breath. The first phase was relief so complete it was almost physical. A loosening she could see in his shoulders and the line of his throat. The second was something she could not name immediately, something attentive and recalibrating, the expression of a man who has walked into a room expecting to find a professional and has found instead a person and is adjusting to the new information. The third phase locked back into control, but the control was different now. It was fitted differently than it had been before, as if the frame were the same, but the picture inside it had been changed. He said quietly enough that Cosimo did not stir. "He came here," she said. "He knows the building. He's been here enough times that the route is probably comfortable to him. Small dogs self-locate to places they associate with positive experience. He's been asleep for about 40 minutes. Dorian looked at her for a long moment, not through her, at her. She held the gaze with the same steady composure she brought to everything, because composure was not a performance she enacted for his benefit. It was simply the operational state she maintained, because it worked, and she had no reason to suspend it now. He said, "You could have put him in a kennel," she said. He was calmer in my lap. I didn't want him to be stressed. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've been sitting like that for 40 minutes. Closer to 43, she said, because she was precise about time the way she was precise about everything, not as pedantry, but as professional habit. I didn't want to wake him. Something shifted again in that controlled face, something small and significant and entirely unannounced. He moved to the chair across from her desk, the one she kept for owners during consultations, and sat down in it with the careful deliberateness of a man who was choosing to stay, and looked at his sleeping dog and then looked at her, and she had the odd sensation of being studied by someone who was doing it properly for the first time, not assessing her competence, which she had always understood him to take for granted, looking at her, the full length of her, the broad shoulders and the soft body and the capable hands and the face that she knew was not the face that his world rewarded with attention. And he was looking at all of it with the focused attention he normally reserved for things that mattered to him. She felt the look, and did not flinch from it, and did not perform comfort with it, and did not pretend it wasn't happening, because none of those responses would have been accurate. And she was, at bottom, an accurate person. She said, "He's going to need water when he wakes up. Small dogs dehydrate faster than people expect." Dorian said, "Eleanor." It was the first time in 7 years that he had used her first name without the preceding formality of Dr. Marsh. She noted this the way she noted clinical data, with precision and without reaction. He said, "In 7 years, have I ever once asked you how you were?" She considered the question seriously, because he had asked it seriously and he deserved a serious answer. She said, "No." He said, "That was a failure on my part." She said, "You were receiving a professional service. There's no obligation for it to be more than that." He said, "I know what the obligation is. I'm talking about what it should have been." Cosimo shifted in her lap, made one small sound of dreaming contentment, and resettled. They both watched him do it, and in the pause that the dog's small movement created, something realigned in the room the way temperature realigns when a window is opened in a space that has been closed too long. Dorian said, "He trusts you more than he trusts anyone," she said. "He trusts my hands. He's been coming here long enough to know they don't hurt him." Dorian said, quietly, as if he were stating something he was only now fully understanding the weight of, "So have I." She looked at him then, properly, without the clinical filter she usually maintained, and she saw something in his face that she had not expected to see and was not entirely prepared for, which was the specific expression of a powerful man encountering, belatedly, the knowledge of his own blind spot and finding the encounter both uncomfortable and necessary. It was not a comfortable expression on a man like Dorian Voss. It sat on him the way new weather sits on a landscape that has been dry too long, changing the light, changing the texture of things, making familiar shapes look briefly strange. She said, "He's going to wake up in the next 10 minutes or so. You should be here when he does. He'll want to see you." Dorian said, "I'm not going anywhere." He meant she understood. Both things at once. The literal and the other thing that was too new to name precisely but was already present in the room between them, patient as the sleeping dog and considerably less small. She handed him one of the paper cups from the dispenser on her desk and poured tea from her thermos into it without asking, because he was there. And it was late, and the gesture cost her nothing, and she was, at bottom, a woman who offered comfort when she had it to offer, regardless of whether it had ever been offered back. He accepted the cup with both hands, which was not what she expected, and held it the way people hold warm things when they have been frightened, with the specific gratitude of warmth that arrives after cold. Outside, the October night pressed dark and complete against the clinic windows, and the lavender diffuser ticked softly through its cycle, and Cosimo breathed the unhurried breath of the thoroughly content, and Dorian Voss sat in the consultation chair across from a woman he had looked past for 7 years, and began, at last, to look at. It was not a transformation that announced itself. It was quieter than that. It was the quality of attention he had always given to things that mattered to him, applied now to someone he had been given every opportunity to see and had not seen. And the application of it was its own kind of reckoning, private and irreversible, the way most of the reckonings that actually change a person tend to be. When Cosimo woke 6 minutes later, he lifted his head from Eleanor's elbow, assessed the room with the calm supremacy of a creature who has slept well and expects the world to have arranged itself accordingly, saw Dorian, and made a sound that was not quite a bark and not quite a greeting, but something between them that communicated with perfect small dog clarity that he had known this would be fine all along. Dorian reached across the desk and took the dog with both hands, and Cosimo pressed his nose against the underside of his jaw and vibrated with contentment, and Dorian held the 11 pounds of white dog against his chest and looked over the small head at Eleanor Marsh, still sitting at her desk, tea still warm, patient notes still open, the fleece blanket folded now across her knee, and he said, with the particular care of a man choosing words as if for the first time, "Thank you for taking care of him." And then after a pause that had weight and substance and the texture of something newly decided, he said, "I'd like to come back," she said. "Cosimo's next wellness check is in February," he said. "I know." His gray eyes held hers, steady and direct and completely unhurried. "That's not what I meant." The lavender diffuser ticked. Cosimo yawned, vast and satisfied. Outside the window, the city moved in its complicated and dangerous patterns, full of men who knew Dorian Voss's name and feared it, full of negotiations and debts and the careful architecture of power that he had spent 2 decades constructing, and none of it had changed in the last hour, and all of it somehow felt differently weighted. She looked at him for a long moment with the honest and undeflecting gaze she brought to every assessment that mattered. She said, "Then I suppose you know where to find me." He did. He had always known where to find her. That, she supposed, was the beginning of the difference between knowing where something is and understanding what it is worth. The dog yawned again. Dorian stood, still holding Cosimo, and nodded once, with the particular gravity of a man who is accustomed to making commitments in rooms where they cost him something. He walked to the door, and then he stopped, without turning, and said, quietly enough, that it was for her only. "You should have charged me double for every year I didn't look," she said. "I charged you exactly the market rate for the services provided," he said. "I know." A pause. "I intend to correct the accounting." And then he was gone into the October dark, and the door swung closed on the night air, and Eleanor Marsh sat alone in her immaculate clinic that smelled of antiseptic and lavender, and she looked at the fleece blanket still folded across her knee, and the tea that had gone cool, and the patient notes she had nearly finished, and she allowed herself, in the privacy of her own empty waiting room, a single slow breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh, and was, in its way, the sound of something that has been held a very long time being, at last, carefully set down. The invisible woman had been seen, not with fanfare, not with an audience, not in a room full of people who would be required to witness and confirm the sighting. She had been seen by one man in one room over 43 minutes, and a cup of tea and a sleeping dog, and it was enough. It was precisely enough. She picked up her pen and finished the last patient note with the same careful handwriting she brought to everything, and locked the clinic and drove home through the October dark, and did not try to decide what any of it meant, because she had learned long ago that meaning assembles itself on its own schedule, and her job was simply to be there when it arrived, steady and warm and ready, the way she had always been, the way she would continue to be, visible now to the one pair of eyes that had finally, fully opened. In the weeks that followed, Dorian Voss returned to Marsh Animal Care 3 times on pretexts that became progressively less plausible as excuses and more honest as what they actually were, which was reasons. The first time he came with a question about Cosimo's diet that his own research had already answered, and she answered it again without indicating that she knew he knew, because she was gracious in ways that did not need to be performed. The second time, he came in the evening again, just before close, with Cosimo under one arm and a question that was only superficially about dental hygiene. The third time he came without Cosimo, and he stood in her waiting room in a suit the color of deep water and said, with the direct and undefended simplicity of a man who has decided that the only way through a thing is straight, I'd like to take you to dinner, not as your client, as a man who has been thinking about what it means to overlook something essential for 7 years and would like to stop doing it. She had put down the file in her hand and looked at him with her clear and honest gaze and said, "That's the most precisely worded dinner invitation I've ever received." He said, "I mean it precisely." She said, "I know." And then, because she was accurate, "Yes." What she did not tell him then, and would tell him eventually in the particular way that essential things get told between people who are learning the texture of each other's honesty, was that she had not been as invisible as he had assumed. Invisible to him, yes, but she had been, for a long time, very clearly visible to the structures around him, to the lieutenants who brought other animals to her clinic because they trusted her hands, to the organization's periphery that had grown accustomed to her presence, the way a body grows accustomed to a necessary organ, without ceremony, without particular gratitude, but with the deep and foundational reliance that only becomes apparent in the moment the thing is no longer there. She had, without ever intending it as strategy, become embedded. She knew things, not because anyone had told her, but because 7 years of treating the animals, of men who spoke freely in examination rooms because they did not consider the woman examining their pets to be a meaningful audience, had given her a comprehensive and involuntary education in the internal architecture of Dorian Voss's world. She had learned the names of the lieutenants and their animals and their habits of speech when they thought they were unobserved. She had learned which ones brought their dogs in looking thin and offered explanations that did not quite match the animal's condition, and which ones came in late because they did not want to be logged in appointment records, and which ones asked her, very carefully, very casually, whether she ever treated animals belonging to the Carver organization to the south, which she did not. And the asking of the question told her something she had filed away and forgotten about, until the Tuesday in October when it became relevant again in a way she had not anticipated. Because Cosimo had not simply wandered, she had understood this within the first hour before Dorian arrived, sitting quietly with the sleeping dog in her lap and thinking through the route the dog had taken and the timing of the security rotation and the name of the man Reed had mentioned in the background of that phone call. The name said, sharply and with the particular quality of accusation rather than the inquiry. She had heard the name before. She had written it in the margin of a file 18 months ago and then crossed it out because she did not deal in suspicion and that what she had was only suspicion. The name was Harlan, and Harlan managed the eastern rotation of Dorian's compound security, and Harlan was the reason the rotation had lasted 47 minutes instead of the standard 20, and she did not yet know why. But she knew that the 47 minutes and the opened gate and the route Cosimo had traveled suggested that someone had wanted the dog to be gone, or had wanted the compound to be temporarily unguarded, or both. She did not bring this to Dorian that first night because she was not certain, and she did not deal in uncertainty when the stakes were someone else's safety. She was a diagnostician. She knew that a presenting symptom is not a diagnosis, and that the correct response to a presenting symptom is more information, methodically gathered, before any conclusion is delivered. So she gathered it. Over the following 2 weeks, in the spaces between appointments and after the clinic closed, she reviewed what she knew with the same patient and unhurried precision she brought to a difficult clinical case. She thought about Harlan's name in the background of Reed's call. She thought about the angle of the gate that Cosimo had come through, which she had established because she had asked Reed, when he called back to confirm the dog's safety, very gently and apparently idly, how Cosimo could have gotten out. And Reed had said the east gate had been propped, which was a gate she knew from previous visits was keypad controlled and required authorization to open even partially. She thought about the man who had come into her clinic 8 months ago with a retriever that was not ill and had asked the question about the Carver organization in a voice that was too casual for the question to be casual. She thought about what was underneath all of it, and what was underneath it was a shape she recognized, the shape of a person inside the walls who was making a space in the walls for something outside to enter, and the something outside was not friendly. She had, in her 7 years of being overlooked, also been useful to herself. She had kept notes, not in any system that could be found or attributed, but in her own private and encrypted shorthand in a personal file she maintained separately from everything clinic related, because she was a woman who had learned early that the world does not protect people who are considered decorative or negligible, and that the people who are considered decorative or negligible are therefore wise to protect themselves with information, which is the one resource available to anyone paying close enough attention. She had not gathered the information with any intention of using it. She had gathered it the way some people collect found objects, not knowing what they were for until the moment the shape of a purpose revealed itself. The purpose revealed itself on a Thursday evening when Reed called her not about an appointment, but in the terse and controlled manner of a man who was doing something his employer did not yet know he was doing, and he said, "Dr. Marsh, I need to ask you something that may seem unusual." And she said, "Ask it." And he said, "Is it possible that someone could have used the dog as a distraction to get a rotation gap?" She said, "I've been thinking about that for 2 weeks." And then she told him what she had, all of it. The name, the dates, the angles, the questions she had been asked, the file she had compiled. She was precise and thorough, and she did not editorialize, and she did not suggest conclusions she had not fully supported. And when she finished, there was a silence on Reed's end of the call that was the specific silence of a man recalibrating the dimensions of the room he thought he was standing in. He said, "You've been keeping this," she said. "I didn't know what it was until recently. Now I do," he said. "Does Dorian know any of this?" She said. "I'm telling you first because you're the one who can act on it quickly. What you tell him is your decision." Another silence. Then, "He's going to want to know you did this," she said. "That's also your decision. I'm not telling you so that anyone knows. I'm telling you because it's the right thing to do with the information." She was accurate in this too. She had not kept the file as leverage. She had not kept it as currency. She had kept it because she was a woman who paid attention and wrote things down and believed that accurate information, when it becomes relevant, belongs to the people who need it. The fact that the person who needed it turned out to be Dorian Voss was secondary to the fact that someone innocent might have been hurt without it. Reed acted on it within 24 hours. Harlan was removed from the compound rotation and then from the organization entirely, and the external contact he had been facilitating was identified and neutralized through mechanisms Eleanor did not need to know about and did not ask after. The planned entry into the compound, which had been scheduled for the following week during a meeting that would have gathered 3 of Dorian's senior people in one location, did not occur. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was robbed. Nothing was taken. Because a woman who had been overlooked for 7 years had been paying attention and had written things down and had waited until she was certain and had then given the information to the right person without ceremony or performance or any expectation of recognition. She told Dorian about it the night he took her to dinner. Not all at once, not as a presentation, but in the gradual and honest way that she told him everything, with specificity and without drama, answering his questions fully and watching his face change as the architecture of what she had done assembled itself for him in the telling. She watched him work through what it meant, the years of it, the quiet and unremarked vigilance of it, the file kept not as ambition but as responsibility, and she watched the working through arrive somewhere in his face that she could not name precisely, but that she understood, because it was the same place she had arrived herself when she finally looked honestly at what the 7 years had meant and what she was willing to have them mean going forward. He said when she finished, "You protected something you had no obligation to protect." She said, "I had the information. I had the obligation." He said, most people would have walked away from that information, would have decided it wasn't theirs to carry. She said, most people haven't spent 7 years watching the same operation from the outside. You see things differently from where I was standing. He said, where were you standing? She said, exactly where you put me, on the outside of everything that mattered. It turns out that's an excellent place to see clearly. He was quiet for a long time after that. They were in a restaurant of the kind that Dorian Voss frequented, all low light and thick linen, and the discreet choreography of staff who had been selected partly for their ability to manage a table without appearing to manage it, and the quiet of the room was the genuine quiet of a place that understood that the people inside it were having conversations worth not interrupting. She ate with the uncomplicated enjoyment she brought to good food, without apology, without the performance of restraint that she had noticed other women at other tables enacting for the benefit of the men across from them. And Dorian watched her eat with the same careful and attentive regard he had been giving her since the night in the clinic, as if making up in quality of attention for the years of its absence. He said finally, I owe you more than a dinner. She said, you owe me nothing. What I did because it was right, not because I was keeping a ledger. He said, I know, that's exactly the problem. She raised an eyebrow, which was the closest she came to expressing surprise, and he said, the people who are owed nothing are the ones you most need to account for, because they're operating on principle rather than obligation, and principle is the only thing you actually can't buy. She said, that's a remarkably thoughtful observation for a man running the operation you're running. He said, with something that was not quite a smile, but it was the infrastructure of one. I've had some recent motivation to be more thoughtful. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, Cosimo is due for his vaccination updates in February. I'll send the appointment confirmation to Reed. He said, I'll be bringing him myself. She said, I assumed. He said, Eleanor. And she looked at him, and the gray eyes were entirely open in the way that she had seen them for the first time on that Tuesday in October, minus the relief and minus the shock, with only what was underneath those things remaining, which was attentive and decided and considerably warmer than gray eyes were generally credited with being capable of. He said, you have been the most important person in a room I kept leaving without understanding why I didn't want to leave. She said, after a moment of honest consideration, you're better at this than you seemed like you would be. He said, I had a better example than I deserved. She thought of 7 years, of patient notes and vaccination records and small, precise observations written in the margins of files no one thought to look at, of a dog crossing 11 blocks on a cold October night and climbing into her lap and falling asleep with the utter confidence of a creature who knew, in its uncomplicated animal way, exactly where the warmth was, of a man who had come in expecting to retrieve his dog and had found instead the fact of his own long blindness and had sat down in the consultation chair and held the warm cup and stayed. She said, Cosimo knew where to go. Dorian said, he's always been smarter than me. She smiled then, fully, without qualification, the broad and genuine smile that she had always had and had never had occasion to offer him before, and she saw him receive it the way people receive the first warmth after a long cold, with the specific gratitude of something restored rather than given new, as if this too had always been there, and he was only now, finally, feeling it. There's a particular kind of being seen that has nothing to do with being loud. Eleanor Marsh had always understood this, had understood it in the way that people understand things they have lived with long enough for the understanding to become structural, part of the foundation rather than part of the furniture. She had been the woman that rooms looked past, and then she had been the woman that one room had turned toward, and the turning had not required her to become different or louder or smaller or more decorative or less precisely, bluntly, completely herself. It had required only that someone finally bring the quality of attention she had always been offering everyone else and apply it fully and without reservation to her. The city of Callaway Bay went on in its dangerous and expensive way, full of men who measured worth by surface and found certain surfaces wanting. In an immaculate clinic, 11 blocks from a glass-fronted office building, a lavender diffuser cycled through its program, and the appointment book held a standing slot on the first Tuesday of every month because some things, once established, become necessary. The way warmth becomes necessary, the way honesty becomes necessary, the way being truly seen. Once it happens, makes the preceding invisibility look not like deprivation, but like the long patience of someone who was simply waiting for the right eyes. She had been worth seeing all along. The extraordinary thing was only the timing of when someone had finally looked.